She treated a customer with kindness and got fired for it, but the next day she walked back in as the boss. Before we begin, please hit the subscribe button and let us know where you're watching from in the comments. Megan wasn't looking for trouble. She never had been. She wasn't the type to pick fights or make a scene. She believed in showing up, doing her job, and treating people with kindness. That was how she had been raised. Simple principles: work hard, respect others, and keep your head down when things got messy. But sometimes doing the right thing had consequences. And she was about to learn that the hard way. For almost 3 years, Lancaster Grill had been her second home. It wasn't fancy, just a local diner on the east side of Columbus, Ohio, tucked between a gas station and a laundromat. The kind of place where truckers stopped for coffee, where families came for Sunday breakfast, and where the wait staff learned your order before they learned your name. The job wasn't perfect. The hours were long, the pay wasn't great, and management barely cared. But Megan stuck with it. She had bills to pay. Rent wasn't cheap, and her younger brother, Evan, was in college. He didn't know she helped cover his textbooks and groceries when their mum couldn't. She never told him, just sent a little extra whenever she could. That was why she took double shifts. Why she put up with rude customers. Why she ignored the way her co-workers treated certain people differently. She had seen things that made her stomach turn. How Beth, a senior waitress, would smile and chat with well-dressed businessmen but barely acknowledge customers in work boots or stained uniforms. How Jason, a newer server, would ignore tables altogether if he thought the tip wouldn't be worth his time. How the energy in the restaurant shifted depending on who walked through the doors. It wasn't just about money, it was a choice. A well-dressed customer got conversation. A working-class one got rushed service. And if someone looked like they might not tip well, they barely existed. Megan hated it, but she kept her mouth shut. She had learned the hard way that calling it out didn't change anything. A few months ago, she had made a simple comment, just a casual remark about how a table had been waiting too long, while Beth stood by the counter, scrolling through her phone. Beth had looked her dead in the eye and said, "You don't get paid extra for being a saint, Megan." That was how it was. Either you went along with it or you learnt to stay quiet. Megan had chosen the latter. Until that night. And after that night, nothing would ever be the same. The dinner rush had come and gone. It was a slow Wednesday evening, the kind Megan actually didn't mind. Fewer customers meant fewer complaints, fewer spills, and fewer fake smiles from co-workers who only turned on the charm when it suited them. She was at the counter refilling the sugar dispensers when the bell above the door jingled. An older black man walked in. His clothes were clean but slightly worn, nothing flashy, just a simple button-up and slacks. He carried himself with quiet confidence, but there was something in his posture, in the way he took a brief second to scan the room before stepping forward. Megan recognized that hesitation. She had seen it before, especially in customers who already knew what kind of welcome they were, or weren't, about to get. And sure enough, the response was immediate. Beth, leaning against the counter, didn't even look up from her phone. Jason, who had been joking with another server, glanced toward the door, made eye contact with the man for a split second, then went right back to his conversation. No greeting. No "welcome to Lancaster Grill." Just silence. Megan felt the weight of it. Thick, uncomfortable. This wasn't an accident. Her co-workers had made a choice. For a second, Megan considered keeping her head down. It would be easier. It always was. But then she glanced at the man again. At the way he stood there waiting, like he was giving them a chance to prove him wrong, just this once. So Megan made a choice too. She wiped her hands on a napkin, grabbed a menu, and walked straight over. "Evening, sir," she said, her voice warm but casual. "Just you tonight?" The man met her eyes, and something in his expression softened. "Yes, Mum," he said, his voice steady. Megan smiled. "Follow me." And as she led him toward an open booth, she could feel Beth watching. Feel Jason glancing over. She knew what they were thinking. Knew what would come next. But for now, she didn't care. Megan walked steadily to the booth near the window, setting the menu down before gesturing toward the seat. "You okay with the booth?" The man nodded. "Perfectly fine." As he settled in, Megan pulled a pen from behind her ear. Can I start you off with something to drink? Coffee, he said. Black. Coming right up. She moved quickly, grabbing a fresh pot and pouring the coffee herself. She could feel Beth's eyes on her, could feel Jason watching too, but she didn't turn around. Setting the steaming cup down in front of the man, she smiled. Let me know if you need anything else. The man glanced around the restaurant, then back at her. You the only one working tonight? Megan knew what he meant. She flicked her gaze toward the counter. Beth was whispering something to Jason, both of them barely even trying to hide their smirks. She let out a quiet breath. Feels like it sometimes, she said. That made him chuckle. He flipped open the menu, scanning the options. What's good here? Megan tilted her head, thinking. Depends on what you're in the mood for. If you want something hearty, the pot roast is made fresh. But if you want my favorite, the grilled salmon's the way to go. He raised an eyebrow. That's so. She nodded. Promise you won't regret it. He smiled, small but genuine. Salmon it is. Megan jotted it down. Great choice. She turned, walking back to the kitchen. But just as she reached the counter, she heard Beth mutter, just loud enough to be heard. She's wasting her time. Megan clenched her jaw but kept walking. She placed the order, then returned with a fresh coffee refill. But as she approached the booth, she could feel it. The shift. It was subtle, but it was there. The way Beth's eyes narrowed. The way Jason kept glancing toward the booth, like he was waiting for Megan to slip up. Even Tom, the manager, had peeked out from his office, scanning the room before disappearing again. Megan had the sinking feeling that she had just put a target on her back. But she wouldn't know how bad it was until the next morning. Megan had barely slept. Something about Beth's muttered words. Jason's smirk. The way Tom had peeked out of his office. It didn't sit right. But she told herself she was overthinking. She had done nothing wrong. If anything, she had done exactly what a waitress was supposed to do. Serve customers. So why did her stomach twist as she pulled into the Lancaster Grill parking lot? The air was crisp, the sun barely peeking over the buildings as she grabbed her apron from the passenger seat. A couple of cars were already in the lot, including Tom's. Megan stepped inside, expecting the usual. Beth and Jason standing around chatting. The kitchen crew prepping for the morning shift. The radio humming low in the background. But something was off. Beth wasn't leaning against the counter like she usually did. Jason wasn't making coffee or cracking jokes with the line cooks. Instead, both of them were watching her. Beth had a sly little smile. Jason had his arms crossed. And neither of them said a word. Megan's grip tightened on her apron. Then, the sound of a door creaking open. Tom. He stood in the doorway of his office, looking at her like he had been waiting for this moment. Megan, he said flatly, come with me. A cold pit settled in her stomach. No. Tom didn't answer, just turned and walked back into his office. Megan swallowed hard. She could feel Beth and Jason still watching as she made her way to the back. She took a breath, squared her shoulders and stepped inside. The office was cramped, the desk covered in paperwork and old coffee stains. A file sat open in front of Tom, but he wasn't looking at it. Instead, he leaned back in his chair, let out a slow breath and said, "We're letting you go." The words hit like a slap. Megan blinked, her mind scrambling to make sense of what she had just heard. Well, Tom's expression didn't change. It's not working out. Her heart pounded. Not working out. She let out a sharp laugh, one that had no humor in it. I've been here almost 3 years. I've never missed a shift, never been late. Tom exhaled through his nose, like he was already tired of the conversation. It's a decision we've made. Megan knew what that meant. Her throat tightened. This is because of last night, isn't it? Tom didn't confirm it. He didn't have to. His silence was enough. Megan felt heat rise to her face. So I get fired for doing my job. Tom's fingers tapped against the desk. You can collect your final paycheck next week. That was it. No warning. No explanation. Just out. Megan clenched her fists. But she knew there was no point in arguing. She untied her apron, set it on the chair and turned to leave. At the door, she hesitated. Then, forcing herself to look back at Tom, she said, "You know this isn't right." Tom didn't even flinch. Megan shook her head and walked out. Beth was still standing near the counter when she stepped back into the main dining area, a knowing smirk on her face. Jason was pretending to wipe down a table, but he wasn't even trying to hide the satisfaction in his eyes. They had been waiting for this. Megan felt her face burn, not with embarrassment, with anger. She wanted to say something, call them out, make a scene, demand to know how they could be so damn heartless, but she didn't. She wouldn't give them the satisfaction. She lifted her chin, walked past them without a word, and pushed through the doors into the cold morning air. For the first time in 3 years, she had no job, no paycheck, no backup plan. She got into her car, slammed the door shut, and gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned white. Her breath came in short, sharp bursts. How was she going to pay rent? How was she going to help Evan with his groceries? How was she... Her phone buzzed. Megan ignored it at first. Then she glanced at the screen. Unknown number. She hesitated. Then, with a shaking hand, she answered. "Hello?" A deep voice came through the line. Steady, familiar. "Megan, this is Richard Lawson." Megan sat up straighter in the driver's seat, gripping the phone a little tighter. "I'm sorry, who?" The voice on the other end was calm, deliberate. "Richard Lawson. The man you served last night at Lancaster Grill." Her breath caught. She had barely spoken to him beyond taking his order and checking in on his meal. And yet, he had found her number. Her mind raced. Did he hear about what happened? Before she could say anything, Richard continued. "I heard what happened." Of course he had. News traveled fast in places like Lancaster Grill. A restaurant was its own ecosystem. Every small shift, every rumor, every change in staff spread through the grapevine in hours, not days. Megan let out a bitter laugh. "Yeah, well, I guess I should have ignored you like everyone else." A pause. Then Richard said something that made her freeze. "That's exactly why I'm calling." She frowned. "I don't understand." Another pause. Then his voice came through, steady as ever. "I wasn't just there for dinner last night, Megan." Her grip on the phone tightened. "I was there to see how my employees treat people." Megan's breath caught. "Your employees?" "I own Lancaster Grill." For a moment the words didn't even register. She sat frozen, her mind struggling to catch up. "I'm sorry, what?" she finally managed. "You heard me." Richard's tone didn't change. "I make it a habit to visit my restaurants unannounced. No formal inspections, no warning. I come in as just another customer. That's how you learn the truth about how a business is really being run." Megan's chest felt tight. "And what did you learn?" she asked, already knowing the answer. Richard sighed. "That I have a serious problem with my staff." Megan let out a humorless chuckle. "Yeah, no kidding." There was another pause, then Richard asked, "How long had you been working there?" "Almost 3 years." 3 years, he repeated, like he was turning it over in his mind. "And in that time you never missed a shift?" "Not once." "Never been late?" "No." Megan exhaled, frustration creeping into her voice. "I kept my head down, did my job, treated people like human beings, and apparently that was enough to get me fired." Richard didn't respond right away. Then, quietly, he said, "That's exactly why I'm calling." Megan furrowed her brows. "I don't understand." A beat of silence. Then, his next words stopped her cold. "I let them fire you on purpose." Megan's stomach dropped. "Do what?" "Needed to see what they would do," Richard explained. "I wanted to know if this was just about bad service or if it was something deeper. And now I have my answer." Megan shook her head. "So you let them throw me out just to prove a point?" Richard didn't deny it. "I know it wasn't fair," he admitted. "But now, I know exactly who I can't trust to run my business the way it should be run." Megan felt her pulse thudding in her ears. "And what does that mean for me?" There was a shift in Richard's tone, something firm, almost authoritative. "It means I need someone I can trust," he said. I need someone who actually understands what it means to run a restaurant fairly. Someone who doesn't pick and choose who gets treated with dignity based on their own prejudices. Megan frowned. I still don't see what this has to do with me. Richard's next words hit like a brick. I want you to come back. Megan inhaled sharply. What? As the new manager. Her breath caught. Her brain scrambled to process what she had just heard. What? You heard me, Richard said. I fired your manager this morning. Tom is done. Megan's mouth fell open. Beth and Jason were going to lose their minds. I know this is sudden, Richard continued, but I'm not interested in anyone else taking over. You understand what matters in a workplace. You know how people should be treated. That's exactly what Lancaster Grill needs. Megan swallowed hard. I don't know if I can do this. Yes, you can, Richard said firmly. And you should. She stared out the windshield, her mind spinning. Less than 24 hours ago, she had been tossed aside like she didn't matter. And now she was being offered the very position of the man who had fired her. She took a slow breath. What do you say? Richard asked. Megan hesitated. She could still hear Beth's mocking voice, Jason's smug silence, Tom's dismissive tone. They had counted her out. Thought they had gotten rid of her for good. But now she had a chance to be the change they never saw coming. Megan lifted her chin, gripping the phone a little tighter. I'll do it, she said. Richard let out a satisfied breath. Good. Come in tomorrow morning. You start at 8. Megan nodded, even though he couldn't see her. I'll be there. As she hung up, she sat in stunned silence for a moment, gripping the wheel as the reality of it all sank in. Less than a day ago, she had walked out of Lancaster Grill with nothing. Tomorrow, she would be walking back in as the boss. And she wasn't coming to play nice. Megan stood outside Lancaster Grill, gripping the strap of her bag. The morning air was sharp, the kind that cut right through your clothes, but she barely felt it. She had spent all night thinking about this moment. Yesterday, she had walked out of this building with nothing. No job, no explanation, no respect. Today, she was stepping back in, with one thing Beth, Jason and Tom never imagined she would have. Power. She inhaled deeply, squared her shoulders and pushed open the door. The scent of fresh coffee and bacon filled the air, just like it always had. Customers were scattered across the booths, forks clinking against plates, the low hum of conversation blending with the radio playing in the background. At first, nobody noticed her. Then Beth turned from the counter, saw her, and froze. Jason, who had been laughing with a busboy, caught sight of her too, his mouth snapped shut mid-sentence. A flicker of something, confusion, unease, crossed his face. It was almost too perfect. Megan let the moment stretch, just long enough for them to squirm, before walking toward the counter and setting her bag down with purpose. Beth recovered first. She scoffed, crossing her arms. What the hell are you doing here? Megan tilted her head. You'll find out soon enough. Beth's smirk faltered. Before she could say anything else, a door opened at the back of the restaurant. Tom stepped out from the office, already looking irritated, flipping through a stack of papers. Beth, I need you to... Then he saw her. His whole body went rigid. His eyes flicked to Beth, then Jason, like he was trying to piece together what was happening. Megan, he said slowly, you don't work here anymore. Megan smiled, but there was no warmth in it. Actually, she said, I do. Tom blinked. What? Another voice cut in before she could answer. I believe I can clarify that. Every head in the room turned. Richard Lawson walked in, calm and collected as ever. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his tailored coat, his expression unreadable. He scanned the room, taking his time, before landing on Tom. Beth's face paled. Jason looked like he wished he could disappear. Tom opened his mouth, then closed it. Richard stopped beside Megan and turned to face the staff. His voice was steady, measured, but carried authority. As of this morning, Lancaster Grill has undergone some management changes, he said. Effective immediately, Tom. Your position is terminated. Beth gasped. Jason looked like he had been punched in the gut. Tom's face turned an ugly shade of red. Wait a damn minute. No, this... Richard cut him off. "I've already heard enough from you." Tom's mouth snapped shut. Megan almost felt bad. Almost. Richard turned toward the rest of the staff. "Some of you may be wondering what's going on," he continued. "Let me make it simple. Last night I visited this restaurant as a regular customer." He let the words sink in. "And what I witnessed was unacceptable." Nobody dared to speak. Richard gestured toward Megan. "This woman was the only employee who treated me with respect, the only one who did her job the way it should be done." He turned back to the staff, his expression hardening. "The rest of you? Some of you ignored me completely. Some of you made it clear you had no interest in serving certain customers at all." His voice sharpened. "Wednesday today." The silence in the restaurant was thick. Then Richard turned back to Megan. "Megan is your new manager." Beth's mouth fell open. Jason's jaw clenched. The busboy standing near the kitchen looked like he wanted to clap. Megan finally let herself smile. She turned toward Beth and Jason, who were still stunned silent, and leaned against the counter. "Well," she said lightly, "this is awkward." Beth's expression twisted. "You—" She turned to Richard, voice sharp. "You can't be serious." Richard's face didn't change. "Oh, I'm very serious." "This is ridiculous," Beth snapped. "You're making a mistake." Richard's voice stayed calm, firm. "No, Beth. The mistake was assuming I wouldn't notice." Beth snapped her mouth shut. She wasn't stupid. She knew walking out meant losing her paycheck, and Beth wasn't about to do that. Jason, on the other hand, wasn't as smart. "This is bullshit," he muttered under his breath. Richard turned to him. "You're welcome to quit as well." Jason froze. His mouth opened, then closed, like he was doing the math in his head. Beth glared daggers at Megan, but Megan just smiled back. "Looks like we all have a lot of adjusting to do," she said, her voice light but firm. "So let's get to work." She watched as Beth stormed toward the coffee machine, mumbling under her breath. Jason grabbed a rag and started wiping down a table, his movements stiff with anger. Richard gave Megan a knowing look. "I have a feeling you'll do just fine here." Megan exhaled, watching as the restaurant settled into a new reality. One where she was in charge. And for the first time since she walked into this building 3 years ago, she felt something she hadn't before. Respect. Megan didn't expect things to change overnight. She knew Beth and Jason wouldn't make it easy. But she didn't care. Because the moment Richard walked out that door, leaving her officially in charge, the real work began. And Megan was ready for it. The first week was rough. Beth barely spoke to her unless absolutely necessary. Gone were her fake, syrupy smiles, now replaced with tight-lipped silence. Jason sulked through every shift, making it painfully obvious that he was only sticking around because he had no better options. The rest of the staff? Some adjusted, some didn't. 2 servers quit within days. No notice, no goodbye, just walked out when they realized the old rules weren't coming back. Megan didn't lose sleep over it. She wasn't here to make friends. She was here to fix a restaurant that had been broken for too long. And slowly, things started to shift. She spent her first few days watching, taking note of who actually worked, who dragged their feet, who needed guidance. It was easier than she expected. The kitchen staff, who had always kept their heads down, began to speak up more, offering suggestions, pointing out unfair practices that had been ignored. The younger servers, who had once followed Beth's lead, started watching Megan instead. And one night, a busboy named Noah, a college kid working nights to pay for school, stopped her as she wiped down the counter. "You really got rid of Tom for that?" His voice was careful. Megan looked up. "For what?" "For being a jackass to customers." He shifted awkwardly. "I mean, we all knew it happened, but I didn't think anyone actually cared." Megan set the rag down, looked him in the eye. "I care." Noah hesitated, then nodded. "Good." And just like that, things started to change. It wasn't immediate. But over time, the entire energy of Lancaster Grill began to shift. Customers, ones who had been ignored before, started coming back. Some stopped Megan on their way out, just to say they noticed the difference. Regulars who had never spoken much started chatting with the staff. Tits went up. Tension went down, and for the first time in a long time, Megan felt like this place actually had a future. Then, one afternoon, Richard Lawson walked in. Megan was in the back, balancing invoices, when she heard his voice. "How's my investment doing?" She turned, pushing the paperwork aside, and smirked. "I think we're in good shape." Richard glanced around. The restaurant was busy, not just with customers, but with something else. Something lighter. The bitterness, the resentment, the tension that had once poisoned the place? "Done." Richard nodded, satisfied. "Told you you'd be fine." Megan leaned against the counter. "You didn't exactly give me a choice." Richard chuckled. "No, I didn't." She exhaled, glancing around. "It's weird." "What is?" "For the longest time, this job was just a paycheck." She shook her head. "And now, it's something more." Richard's expression softened. "Funny how life works, huh?" Megan thought back to that morning in her car, feeling like she had lost everything. And yet, here she was. She wasn't just another waitress anymore. She was the boss. And she had made damn sure Lancaster Grill would never go back to the way it was. Because doing the right thing wasn't always easy. Sometimes it cost you everything. But sometimes it gave you more than you ever imagined. Megan didn't need Richard to tell her she had done a good job. She could see it. She saw it in the way customers stayed longer, smiled more, actually felt welcome. She saw it in the way her staff began working with purpose, not just going through the motions. And most importantly, she saw it in herself. For years, she had kept her head down, played it safe, ignored the things that made her stomach turn. But not anymore. Now she stood taller. Because she had changed something. Because she had proved something. And because she knew she wasn't done yet. Of course, not everyone was happy. Beth still walked around like she had been personally wronged by the universe. Jason lasted another 2 weeks before finally quitting. No big speech, no confrontation, just tossed his apron on the counter and walked out mid-shift. No one missed him. Beth? She stuck around. But she had lost her power. The unspoken hierarchy, the one where she decided who deserved good service and who didn't, was gone. She tried to test Megan a few times, snide remarks, small acts of defiance. Megan shut it down, every time. And eventually Beth learned her place. She didn't have to like it. She just had to accept it. 3 months later, the restaurant was thriving. Sales had gone up. Complaints had gone down. Megan had hired new staff, people who actually wanted to work, people who treated customers like human beings. The difference was undeniable. And one afternoon, as she wiped down the counter, a familiar figure walked through the door. Richard Lawson. He took his usual seat, the booth by the window. No hesitation. No scanning the room to see if he'd be ignored. Megan grabbed a menu out of habit, but Richard just smirked. "I think we both know I don't need that." She laughed. "Coffee?" "Always." She poured the cup herself, setting it in front of him. Richard took a sip, then leaned back, watching the restaurant. "So, how's it feel?" he asked. Megan raised an eyebrow. "How's what feel?" "Knowing you were the right choice." She thought about it for a moment. Then she smiled. "Feels like I finally did something that matters." Richard nodded. And that was all that needed to be said. The message of the story. Doing the right thing isn't always easy. Megan stood up for one customer. It cost her her job. But in the end, it gave her everything. Your values define you. Beth and Jason thought cutting corners and playing favorites was just part of the job. Megan knew it was wrong, and because of that, she won. Respect isn't given, it's earned. Megan didn't demand respect. She proved she deserved it, not just from her staff, but from Richard, from her customers, and from herself. If you have the power to change something, you should. It's easy to ignore things that don't directly hurt us, but the moment we choose to speak up, step up, and take action, that's when real change happens. Megan walked out of Lancaster Grill as a nobody. She walked back in as the boss, and she never looked back. Megan's story isn't just about a restaurant, it's about life. How often do we see injustice and tell ourselves it's not our problem? How many times have we kept quiet, afraid of the consequences? But here's the truth. The cost of doing nothing is often greater than the cost of speaking up. Integrity is a choice. Megan chose to treat people fairly, even when it was unpopular. In life, your values will be tested. Will you stand firm? The right thing isn't always the easy thing. Speaking up might cost you opportunities in the short term, but in the long run, it defines who you are. Leadership isn't about a title, it's about action. Megan didn't become the boss because she demanded power. She earned it by proving she was the kind of leader people needed. Wherever you are, work, school, everyday life, remember this. If you see something wrong, don't just accept it. Be the one who changes it.